You know, it's not surprising that in this day and age, the most up-to-date and respectable form of academic philosophy taught in our universities is what is called logical analysis. A logical analyst, you know, is the kind of fellow who, the moment you say something, you hardly get a word out of your mouth before he says, "Now, just precisely what do you mean by that?" You can't take a step of the way in unfolding a proposition, or a thesis, or an idea without his going minutely into the meaning of each word that you say. And as a result of this sort of technique, most logical analysts have come to the conclusion that the problems that have been discussed by philosophers for several thousand years are mostly meaningless problems. Because when you look very precisely at the form of words in which they're stated, and you analyze each word bit by bit, you come to the conclusion that it didn't really mean anything. But I think there's a profound fallacy in this, because it's based on the assumption that the meaning of words is supposed to be precise. But unfortunately for this sort of approach to things, we're living in a world which isn't precise, where nature, on the whole, is extraordinarily vague. I mean, it would be very nice for purposes of precise calculation if the Earth, in its orbit around the Sun, went round in a neat 360 days. But it doesn't. It goes round in 365 and some wretched fraction. Everything's a little odd. Everything's a little off-center. For example, how are we to decide exactly when now is? You know? When is now? I look at my watch and take a good look at the second hand to find out exactly when now is. Well, that second hand, I can see it, so it must have some size. So let's take out a magnifying glass. Then it appears that the thing that marks now looks about so wide. And then, well, let's draw it a bit finer, and draw it a bit finer. But we never seem to be able to get to the end of analyzing. Now, you see, is fuzzy. It's vague. It's like the field of vision which you have in front of your eyes. You can see clearly in the middle, but going out to the sides, things get a little bit blurred. Or where exactly does the head stop and the neck begin? You hear? You hear? You hear? We can't really decide. The only way to be perfectly clear about where the head stops and the neck begins is to chop off the head. Then you've got a neat dividing line. In other words, the whole process of analysis is a process of chopping, of cutting apart, of approaching nature with a knife, with a dividing line, with a scalpel. And although there is most definitely a place in life for precision, for clear distinctions, for the attitude of the knife, this kind of thing can be enormously overdone. And if one approaches the poet, I remember a cartoon once I saw in a newspaper, showed Shakespeare walking on the clouds of immortality, holding his head in his hand. Oh, he was being pursued by a pedestrian little man wearing a cap and gown, saying, "Mr. Shakespeare, your use of the conjunction if." And one knows all too well a certain style of personality which likes to be precise. The sort of person lines of the old story about Achilles and the tortoise. You know perhaps the problem of Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles and the tortoise agree to have a race. But because Achilles can run twice as fast as the tortoise gets a head start. Achilles begins here, and the tortoise begins here. Now then, when the tortoise has gone half the distance between his starting point and Achilles' starting point, when the tortoise goes that much and is here, Achilles, who can run twice as fast, moves from here to here. Then the tortoise goes half as far as that distance. Achilles does twice as much, and he lands up here. And then the tortoise goes half as far as he went again, and lands up here. Achilles does twice as much, and he's here. And so the tortoise goes half as far again, and Achilles does twice as much, and he lands up here. And notice, you see, Achilles is still behind the tortoise. And the next time the tortoise will go half as much as that, and Achilles will come up to here. And we shall go on doing this, thinking about smaller and smaller and smaller intervals. And as a result of this, Achilles will never overtake the tortoise. Now, of course, in actual life, Achilles jolly well does overtake the tortoise and goes right by him. But why this is a problem is it is a way of thinking about the situation that is infinitely and indefinitely analytical. It doesn't, as it were, let life go on, but it stops to analyze the whole business. It breaks it down into minuter and minuter and minuter quantities, so that the whole thing is delayed. The whole situation is, as it were, stopped and killed. And this will always happen whenever we get into the bind, the rut of trying to think too precisely. And it's for this reason that the Taoists, and I think also the Confucian philosophers of China, are very mistrustful of logic chopping, of being too analytical about the meaning of words. Let's take, for example, a word that is absolutely fundamental to Chinese thought, a word which I've used a great deal in this program. Tao. You know this is in English. They must come to us in the same way as light comes to our heart. This thing, then, is mysterious and unknown. Like the hermit sage in one of the most famous of all Chinese poems, Jia Dao's Seeking for the Hermit in Vain. I asked the boy beneath the pine. He said, the master's gone alone, herb picking, somewhere on the mountain, cloud hidden, whereabouts unknown. The whole power of the poet is in the mysterious imprecision of the old man's whereabouts, which, somehow or other, brings the spirit of the hermit sage closer to the inquirer than an actual meeting. His absence says more than his presence. Lost somewhere on the cloud-hidden mountain, he communicates far more than if he had come down to explain himself. And the spirit would be totally missed by the literal-minded, no-nonsense sort of person who at this point would want to clear away the clouds and the mystery, or rush in and find out just exactly where the old fellow has gone and just what herbs he is picking. You know, it's absolutely impossible to understand and appreciate our natural universe unless you know when to stop investigating. In our restlessness, we're always tempted to climb every hill, to cross every skyline, to find out what lies beyond. Yet as you get older and wiser, it isn't just flagging energy, but rather increasing wisdom that teaches you to look at mountains from below, or perhaps just climb them a little way. Or at the top, you can no longer see the mountain. And beyond, on the other side, there is perhaps just another valley like this. An old Indian aphorism says, what is beyond is that which is also here. And you mustn't mistake this for a kind of blasé boredom, tiring of adventure. It's the startling recognition that in the place where we are now, we have already arrived. This is it. What we are seeking is, if we are not totally blind, already here. For if you must follow that trail up the mountainside to its bitter end, you will discover that it leads eventually right back to the suburbs. But only an exceedingly stupid person will think that that's where the trail ruins the whole composition. place where we are may be considered the center of the universe. Anywhere that we stand can be considered the destination of our journey. But we have to be receptive and open. We have, in other words, to do what Lao Tzu advised when he said, while being a man, yet one should also preserve a certain femininity, and thereby one will become a channel for the whole universe. You know, that's one of the things which I believe in our culture of the West is submerged. The feminine values are despised values. And we find typically among men a strange kind of reluctance to be anything but a man. A kind of anxiety to be 100% male. And that's a kind of monster. A man who is 100% male, 100% tough guy, is a sort of human mollusk who has no softness and no sensitivity. And indeed, it's a common psychological observation that people who are constantly anxious to prove their masculinity, who are scared to death of being sissy, of being weak, of being unaggressive, those are the very people who have doubts about their own masculinity, who are not really sure of it. And so, there is a tremendous necessity for us to value alongside, as it were, the aggressive masculine element symbolized by the sword, the receptive feminine element symbolized perhaps by the open flower. For after all, our human senses are not knives, they're not hooks, they are the soft ball of the eye, the delicate drum of the ear, the soft skin on the tips of the fingers and on the body. It is through these delicate, receptive things that we basically receive our knowledge of the world. And therefore it is through a kind of weakness and softness that it is possible for knowledge to come to us. So, putting it in another way, we have to come to terms with nature by wooing her rather than fighting her. Not just putting nature at the so-called distance of objectivity as if she were an enemy to be shot, but something rather to be known by embrace like a beloved wife. For you see, what does one really want to know about? Does one rather want to manage the whole thing? Does one want to be a kind of omnipotent God who controls it all? Or does one rather want to enjoy it? One cannot, after all, enjoy what you are all the time anxious about controlling. One of the nice things about one's own body is you don't have to think about it all the time. If you had, when you woke up in the morning, think about every detail of your circulation, you'd never get to there. As was well said, the mystery of life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced.